What would you do if every door in your life had been quietly, firmly shut? Not slammed, not argued over, just closed. And the only thing left in your hands was a tool you barely knew how to use. What if the one person who believed in you was already gone, and all that remained of their faith was a worn leather strap and a set of hand planes wrapped in oilcloth? We'd like to invite you to pull up a chair for a moment. Find somewhere comfortable. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from tonight, because this is the kind of story that deserves to be heard slow. This is the story of Dora Finch and the crumbling mill house at the bend of Culver Creek. Dora Finch came into the town of Harwick, Pennsylvania on a Tuesday in early October, the year 1907, with a canvas pack on her back and a wooden crate roped to a borrowed handcart. She was 22 years old. She had $11.40, 3 days of cold biscuits wrapped in newspaper, and no living family to speak of. The handcart belonged to the freight station in Caldwell, 2 counties east, where she had worked for 14 months cleaning floors and sorting parcels after her Aunt Bess had died and left the house to a church she'd never attended. Dora had not argued. She had packed what was hers and walked away, because she had learned early that arguing with closed doors only bruised your knuckles. The crate on the handcart held everything that mattered. Inside it, nested in sawdust and wrapped in old flannel, were the tools of Edmund Farrow, cabinet maker, and the only teacher she had ever had. Edmund Farrow had been 71 years old when Dora first showed up at his workshop at the age of 14, sent by a neighbor who was tired of watching the girl whittle fence into something resembling birds. He had looked at her over his spectacles for a long moment and said nothing. Then he had handed her a block plane and pointed at a rough-cut board of white oak and walked away to his own bench. That was how it began. For 7 years, she worked beside him. She learned the grain of wood, the way some people learn a language, by feel before by rule. She learned the difference between a whisper cut and a fighting cut. She learned to read the tension in a piece of timber the way you might read the mood of a quiet person, not by what they said, but by how they held themselves. Edmund Farrow had never called her gifted. He had called her attentive, which was, she came to understand, his highest praise. He died in March, 4 months before she arrived in Harwick. A short illness, a shorter goodbye. He left her his tools, every last one, in a letter so straightforward and unsentimental, it made her cry for an hour and then feel steadied for a week. He also left her one other thing, a name, a place, a sentence written in his careful, cramped hand at the bottom of the letter. There's a grist mill at the bend of Culver Creek, outside a town called Harwick. Hasn't run in 15 years. The wheel is gone, but the stone is good. I always thought it had something left in it. Maybe you'll think so too. She hadn't understood why he wrote it. She still didn't, entirely. But she had nothing else pointing anywhere, and Edmund Farrow's instincts had never once been wrong. The town of Harwick was not an unkind place, exactly, but it was a cautious one. It had seen a certain number of strangers pass through chasing certain kinds of dreams, and it had grown the particular wariness of a place that had been disappointed before. The main street was clean and orderly, with a hardware store, a dry goods, a post office, a church, and a tavern that also served as the informal seat of local opinion. When Dora came through it with her handcart rattling on the uneven road, heads turned with that particular quality of stillness that means people are watching without wanting to appear to watch. She stopped first at the dry goods store to ask directions to the mill. The man behind the counter, who introduced himself as Mr. Harlan Pruitt, had a face built for skepticism. He was perhaps 50, with close-cut gray hair, and the thick forearms of a man who had done physical work his whole life. "The Culver Creek Mill," he said, and let the words sit in the air between them for a moment. "Not much to see out there, miss. Place has been empty since old Gus Renner gave up on it back in '92. Nobody's had use for it since the big grain operation opened up out on Route 9. "Who owns it now?" Dora asked. Pruitt scratched the side of his jaw. "County tax records, most likely. Renner's family sold off the farmland before they moved to Pittsburgh. Far as I know, the mill building itself just sat." He paused. "It's in rough shape. I'd like to see it," Dora said. He gave her directions. She thanked him. As she turned to go, she caught the look he exchanged with the only other person in the store, a woman buying flour who hadn't spoken a word, and she felt the weight of that look settle on her shoulders like a coat. 2 sizes too large. She went anyway. The road to Culver Creek wound south out of town through a corridor of old hickory trees just beginning to turn. The air smelled of leaf rot and creek water. The handcart was harder to manage on the unpaved track, and she had to lean into it on the soft patches. After about 1.5 miles, the road bent left, and the creek came into view through the trees, a wide, flat-running stretch of dark water with a limestone shelf along one bank. And there was the mill. It was not as bad as she'd feared. It was bad, but not hopeless. The building was stone on 3 sides, and timber framed on the 4th. And the stone walls were intact, solid, the kind of dry-stack limestone construction that is good for 300 years if you leave it alone. The timber side had suffered. Several boards had fallen away, and the framing beneath showed weathering and rot in places. The roof had lost a third of its cedar shakes on the south slope, leaving bare boards that had warped and cupped. One window was entirely gone, just an empty square opening with a bird's nest in the corner. The mill race that had once directed water to the wheel was choked with silt and fallen branches, and the wheel itself was indeed gone. Nothing left but the iron stub of the axle jutting from the wall. Inside was worse. The floor was a patchwork of solid oak boards and gaping holes where boards had given way or been removed. The great millstone, a granite disc 4 feet across, was still there, resting on its lower stone, covered in a thick gray rime of old flour dust and mold. The wooden machinery that had once connected the stone to the wheel was reduced to a scatter of fallen timbers and rusted iron fittings. Dora stood in the middle of it, her boots on a section of floor she'd tested twice before trusting. She turned slowly. Dust motes drifted in the light from the open window. Somewhere above her in the rafters a bird moved. Edmund Farrow had said the stone was good. She crossed the uneven floor carefully and put her hand on the millstone. It was cold and immensely solid, the granite rough under her palm. She knocked on it with her knuckle and listened to the sound. Dense sound. Not cracked. She stood there for a long time. The thing she was thinking was not romantic or hopeful in any simple way. It was more practical and harder-edged than that. She was thinking the walls will hold. The roof can be fixed. The floor is oak, and oak can be replaced with oak. The window can be glazed. The machinery. She wasn't thinking about the machinery yet. She was thinking about the walls. She went to find the county land office. It was in Harwick, in a room behind the post office, staffed by a thin man named Mr. Cecil Vore, who wore a suit that had been pressed so many times it had gone to a shine at the elbows. He looked at her with the careful blankness of a man who has long ago decided not to be surprised by anything that walks through his door. "The Renner mill?" he said, pulling a ledger from a shelf without being asked. "Yes, it's been on the tax rolls as an abandoned property for 11 years. The county assumed the deed in 1901 when no heir came forward to pay the outstanding taxes." "What's the back tax total?" Dora asked. He ran a finger down the column. "As it stands, including accumulated penalties, $38. $38. She had $11.40. She did not flinch. "Is there a structure for paying in installments?" Mr. Vore set down his pen and looked at her over his ledger in a way that managed to convey, without a single discourteous word, that this was not a common arrangement, that he personally did not expect her to be able to keep up with it, and that he had seen optimism of this variety before without being moved by it. "There is no formal provision," he said. "However," he paused, "the county has no interest in maintaining the property indefinitely. If a buyer were to put down a good faith deposit and demonstrate active improvement, the board might consider a deferred arrangement on a case-by-case basis." Dora laid $9 on the counter. It was more than 3/4 of everything she had. Her hand was perfectly steady. Mr. Vore looked at the money for a moment. Then he reached for a form. Word traveled back to town before she did. She was aware of it when she returned to collect her handcart from where she'd left it propped against the side of the dry goods. There were 2 men, the sidist. There were 2 men standing outside the tavern who hadn't been there before, talking with that particular posture of men who have recently received interesting information and are not quite finished processing it. Mr. Pruitt watched her through his store window. The flower-buying woman she'd seen earlier was now speaking to someone in a doorway and stopped when Dora passed. Dora kept her eyes on the road ahead, as she had learned to do. What she could not avoid was the man on the gray horse who fell in beside her at the edge of town, walking his horse to match her pace. His name was Aldous Greer, and she would come to know that name well, in the way you come to know a weather pattern that follows you across 3 counties. He was the largest landowner in the Culver Creek watershed, a man in his late 40s with the particular ease of someone who has never had to ask permission for anything. "Heard you put money down on the Renner building," he said. "Not a question." "I did," Dora said. She kept walking. "Interesting choice." He let that sit. "I've been meaning to clear that stone myself. Good limestone, some of it. I could use it for a new barn foundation." "The building isn't for sale," Dora said. Greer's horse stopped. She kept walking. He let her get 10 paces ahead before he spoke again. Miss, he paused, waiting for her to supply her name. She didn't. You understand what you've bought, he said. The wheel's been gone since a flood in '89. The race is filled in. Even if you re-roof the thing tomorrow, it's not a functioning mill. It's a stone box on a creek. Dora stopped. She turned around and looked at him, sitting comfortable and certain on his gray horse. I know what it is, she said. Thank you for stopping. She turned and walked. Behind her, she heard Aldous Greer make a sound that was not quite a laugh. Then the slow clopping of hooves turning back toward town. She did not let herself feel the shame of it until she was back on the creek road, out of sight. Then she let it move through her, the cold flush of it, the awareness of how small she was in this particular equation. A 22-year-old woman with $11 turned to $2, buying a broken mill in a county where she knew no one, on the word of a dead man she'd loved like a father. The word for what she felt, standing there on the rutted track with the creek, moving dark and flat beside her, was not despair. It was something closer to the feeling just before you lift something very heavy. The moment when you know how much it weighs, and you haven't lifted it yet, and your body is making a series of quiet decisions. She went back to the mill and made camp. That night she slept in the dry corner of the mill floor, wrapped in her bedroll with the canvas pack as a pillow. The sound of Culver Creek filled the whole building, a constant, low rushing that was oddly like company. She lay awake for a long time listening to it. The walls around her were thick and still, and they had been there for 60 years before she arrived, and would stand for 60 more after she was gone, and something about that steadiness was the most comforting thing she'd encountered in months. She was up before light. She started with the floor. This was what Edmund had always said. Start with what's under your feet. If you don't know what you're standing on, you don't know anything. She went through every board systematically, pressing each once with her boot, listening for the soft give of rot, the crack of split grain. She marked the bad ones with a chalk line and moved on. By noon she had a precise map of the floor in her head. Which sections were sound, which needed replacement, which were structurally compromised and dangerous. Then she opened the crate. She had not opened it since Caldwell. She knelt on the floor and worked the rope loose and lifted the lid and sat for a moment just looking. Edmund Farrow's planes were nested in their flannel wrappings, each one in its proper place. The smoothing plane, the jack, the jointer, the shoulder plane, with the crack in the tote that he'd repaired himself with a wooden wedge and a drop of hide glue. The chisels in their leather roll, the marking gauges, the folding rule with his initials scratched into the brass faceplate. E.F. She lifted out the jack plane and held it. The weight of it was so familiar it felt like a handshake. She had no lumber yet. She had almost no money. But she had the tools and the knowledge to use them, and she had the floor in her head, and she had the walls around her. She put the jack plane back carefully and closed the lid and stood up. She needed to earn money to buy lumber to fix the floor. She walked back into town and went to the hardware store, which was owned by a man named Mr. Oliver Tabb, who was not Mr. Pruett, and had not yet formed an opinion about her. She asked him if he knew of any woodworking needs in the area. Cabinet repair, furniture work, door fitting. He looked at her for a moment. You do cabinet work? I do, she said. 7 years, trained under Edmund Farrow of Caldwell. The name meant nothing to him, but the specificity of it seemed to register. He scratched his chin. Widow Sprague over on Marsh Street has been needing her kitchen cabinets reworked for about a year. Keeps putting it off, because nobody around here does fine work, only rough carpentry. Her pantry door won't close right, and 2 of the drawer faces are split. Dora asked for the address and walked there directly. The woman who answered the door was perhaps 65, with the brisk manner of someone who has run her own household entirely on her own terms for many decades. Her name, she said, was Mrs. Louise Sprague, and she looked at Dora the way you look at something you want to believe in, but have been disappointed by before. The hardware man sent you, she said. I stopped in looking for work, Dora said. He mentioned your cabinets. May I take a look? Mrs. Sprague stepped back and let her in. The kitchen was large and well kept. The cabinets were original to the house, probably 40 years old, built in white pine with simple face frames and wooden knobs. Good, honest work that had given a long service and now needed attention. Dora opened and closed each door, worked each drawer, knelt down to examine the floor clearance on the pantry door that wouldn't close. She identified the problem in about 4 minutes. The door had been hung true once, but the house had settled, and the frame had racked slightly, pulling the hinge side out of plumb by just enough to bind. The drawer faces were split along the grain from old wood movement, a simple repair. I can fix the door today, she said, standing up. The drawers will take another session. Do you have a workbench anywhere I can use? Mrs. Sprague looked at her hands, then at her face. Then, as though making a decision she might regret, said, "The back porch." Dora fixed the pantry door in 2 hours. She planed the hinge mortises deeper on the loose side, reset the screws with wooden plugs to give them fresh purchase, and rehung the door plumb. She adjusted the strike plate and eased the latch. The door swung open and fell closed with the precise cushioned sound of a well-fitted thing. Mrs. Sprague stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her do it without saying a word. When Dora was done, the older woman opened and closed the door 3 times. Slowly, with a particular expression that was not quite satisfaction, but was something close to it. "Where did you say you trained?" she asked. "Edmund Farrow, Caldwell, Clearfield County." Mrs. Sprague nodded slowly. "How much do you charge?" They agreed on a number. It was fair on both sides. When Dora left Mrs. Sprague's house an hour later, she had enough for 2 weeks of food, a roll of roofing felt, and 20 board feet of white oak, which was enough to start. The thing about a reputation in a small town is that it moves sideways before it moves forward. Mrs. Sprague did not go out of her way to recommend Dora to anyone. She simply mentioned, in the course of ordinary conversation over the next 2 weeks, that she'd had her pantry door fixed, and the drawer faces repaired, and the work was good. Very good. The kind of work you didn't see much anymore. A woman, yes, trained in Caldwell, staying out at the old Renner mill. That last part generated its own current of opinion. Harwick did not entirely understand what Dora was doing out there, and a good portion of the town had already made up its mind that it would end in one of 2 ways. She would give up before winter, or she would ask for help that nobody had offered and become a burden. Aldous Greer had said as much in the tavern, in his easy, off-handed way that made declarations sound like observations. She'd taken on more than she knew. The place needed the wheel rebuilt to be worth anything, and that was a job for an engineer and a millwright, not a girl with a box of cabinet tools. He was not unkind about it. He was simply certain. Dora, out at the mill, did not hear this directly, but she felt the shape of it in the way people engaged with her when she came to town. The polite caution. The slightly lowered expectations embedded in ordinary courtesy. She had lived around that particular atmosphere long enough to read it like weather. She worked with a discipline that was not heroic or grand, but simply continuous. Every morning before light, she rose and lit the small stove she had set up in the dry corner, and drank coffee and went to work. She replaced the floorboards section by section, fitting each piece of new oak tight against its neighbor, driving the nails true. She mixed mortar from a bag of lime and sand she'd bought from Mr. Tabb, and repointed the gaps in the stone walls where the wind came through. She re-nailed the fallen boards on the timber side and filled the worst gaps with scraps of pine lath until she could afford proper siding. The roof was the hardest. She was not afraid of heights exactly, but the pitch was steep and the remaining shakes were treacherous underfoot, and she had nobody to hold the ladder. She worked slowly, testing each foothold, pulling the old shakes and replacing them with new ones she'd cut herself from straight-grained cedar she'd found stacked in the back of the mill, dry and forgotten under a fallen shelf. Whoever Gus Renner had been, he'd had good taste in lumber. The cedar had been there 30 years and was perfect. She spent evenings, when the light was gone and she was too tired to use tools safely, reading. She had brought 3 books from Edmund's shelf. A treatise on timber framing construction, a manual of hydraulic engineering from 1882, and a slim volume titled The Craft of the Country Millwright, published in 1889 by a man named Samuel Hook. This last one she read twice, then 3 times, taking notes in the margins in pencil. She was not yet thinking seriously about the wheel, but she was beginning to think. 6 weeks after she arrived, Mrs. Sprague sent her another customer, a man named Mr. Theodore Baum, who had a roll-top desk with a broken tambour mechanism and a cracked side panel. Dora fixed it in a day and a half. Mr. Baum mentioned it to someone. That someone mentioned it to someone else. By the 2nd month, she had steady work. Not lavish work, not comfortable work. Work that paid in careful increments and allowed her to move forward in careful increments. And that was enough. She bought more lumber. She bought a new spool of roofing felt and finished the south slope. She bought a small window sash and glazed it herself and fitted it into the empty opening where the bird had nested. The bird relocated to the eave without apparent objection. She also, in the course of her evenings with Samuel Hook's manual and the 1882 hydraulics text, began to understand something about the mill race. She went out to it in early November, in the thin cold of a gray afternoon, and walked its length twice. The race was the channel that had once diverted water from the creek to power the wheel. A dug trench, about 4 feet wide, lined with limestone, running about 60 feet along the bank before it once curved to meet the wheel. It was full of silt and debris now. The inlet dam a ruined pile of rotted timber and stone. But the lining was intact, the stone held. And the creek, in this bend, had the kind of consistent fall that the hydraulics manual described as favorable. A measurable grade over the length of the race that would generate real head pressure. The wheel itself was the problem. An overshot wheel. The kind this mill had once used, where water poured over the top rather than striking from underneath, needed to be precisely designed and built to the specific measurements of the race, the head pressure, and the stone to be driven. It was not cabinetry. It was a different order of engineering entirely. She went back inside and picked up Samuel Hook's manual again. She was reading by lamplight when she heard the knock. It was late. She set the book down and went to the door she had hung herself on freshly mortised hinges, the door that now opened with the smooth, certain swing of a thing properly made. She opened it. Standing on her new stone step, holding his hat in both hands, was an old man she had never seen before. He was perhaps 75, short and compact, with a white beard trimmed close, and the thick, deliberate hands of someone who had spent a lifetime in heavy work. He looked past her at the interior of the mill, the new floor, the repointed walls, the window glowing with lamplight, and something moved across his face. "Name's Caleb Mott," he said. "I built the original wheel for this mill in 1884. Dora stood in the doorway and looked at him. "I live 2 miles up the road," he said. "Heard someone was working the Renner place. I walked by last month and saw the roof, figured I'd see what was what." He looked at his hat. "I was the last millwright in this county. Retired now, my knees." He paused. "You're reading Hook," he said, nodding at the book visible on her work table behind her. "I am," Dora said. "Hook's good for the theory," Caleb Mott said. "But he never built anything in weather below 40 degrees. His measurements run about 8% off on the bucket pitch when you account for winter flow." He looked at her steadily. "You planning to rebuild the wheel?" Dora stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "I'll make coffee." He came in and looked at everything while she set the water to boil. He walked the floor slowly, testing a board here and there with his foot. He ran a hand along the repointed wall. He stood over the millstone and looked at it for a long time without touching it. "You did this floor?" he said. "I did." He looked at the joint between 2 boards where she'd matched the grain running in opposite directions to keep the run flat. He nodded, once, the way Edmund Farrow had always nodded. "I can't do the heavy work anymore," he said, settling onto the stool she placed for him. "My knees won't have it. But I can tell you what goes where, and I know where the old wheel parts are." He looked up. Renner stored the iron fittings in a shed behind the feed store. "When the flood took the wheel, thought he'd rebuild. Never did. I expect they're still there." Dora set a cup in front of him and said nothing, because she didn't want to break whatever this was. "The lumber for the buckets you'd want to cut from the red oak along the north bank, the trees upstream past the bend," Caleb continued. "Renner planted those in 68, same time he built the race. Said the Rivermill books all recommended planting your own replacement lumber. Good man. Had better instincts than luck." He wrapped both hands around the cup. "If you're going to do this, you'll want to start on the race before the ground freezes." Dora put her own cup down on the table. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. Caleb Mott looked at her with the clear-eyed directness of a man who doesn't have time left for anything complicated. "I built that wheel," he said simply. "I'd like to see something like it turn again before I can't see anything anymore." They started on the race the next morning. It was cold, hard work. The kind of work that strips the romance out of every idea you have ever entertained about yourself. They dug out 60 feet of accumulated silt by hand, Dora doing the heavy excavation, and Caleb directing the repointing of the stone lining and designing the new inlet works on a piece of brown paper he kept in his coat pocket. They worked in the mornings when Caleb's knees allowed, and Dora worked alone in the afternoons and evenings, and they didn't talk much, which suited them both. Word reached Aldous Greer by the 2nd week. He came out on his gray horse on a Thursday, picking his way down the creek track with the confidence of a man who considered all the land around him to be, in some ambient sense, his. He found Dora knee-deep in the race, shoveling, and Caleb Mott sitting on the bank, correcting a drawing. Greer looked at Caleb Mott with an expression that was not quite surprise. "Caleb," he said, "didn't know you were involved in this." Caleb looked up from his drawing. "Now you do," he said, and looked back down. Something shifted in Greer's manner, the way a ceiling shifts when you've added structural support. The same surface, but a different relationship to the load. He turned to Dora. "I want to be straight with you," he said. "I've got grain to mill. Every farmer in this watershed does, and the Route 9 operation charges more than it should. If this mill runs again, and runs clean, there's income in it." He paused. "I was wrong to assume it couldn't be done." Dora straightened up from the trench and looked at him. "I appreciate you saying that," she said, with neither coldness nor warmth. "When the wheel is turning, you're welcome to bring your grain." He nodded. He started to turn his horse, then stopped. "Vor at the land office told me about your deferred arrangement." Another pause. "If you need lumber for the wheel framing, I have a stand of red oak I've been meaning to take down. It's yours if you want it." Dora looked at him for a moment. She thought of the trees Caleb had mentioned, upstream past the bend. She thought of Edmund Farrow, who had said, "Take what's offered from people who offer freely, and earn everything else." "Thank you," she said. "We'll take it." The wheel took 3 months. Caleb Mott's knowledge was precise and deep and detailed in ways that no book could have given her, and his patience with her questions was the same steady, unhurried quality that Edmund Farrow's had been. The patience of someone who has done a thing so long they have forgotten that once they didn't know it either. She learned to read the tension of wheel timber the way she read wood at the bench, by feel before rule. She learned the geometry of bucket pitch and spoke arrangement and the precise calculation of the head pressure Culver Creek could sustain through a normal year. The iron fittings were indeed in the shed behind the feed store, exactly where Caleb had said. Mr. Tabb helped her move them. 3 of the original iron hubs were salvageable. 2 needed to be recast, and for that she went to the blacksmith 2 towns over, a lean woman named Mrs. Estelle Wynne, who ran the forge she'd inherited from her father and who took one look at Dora's drawings and said, without preamble, "Tuesday." They were ready on Tuesday. Winter broke in late February. In March, Culver Creek came up with the snowmelt and ran fast and cold and full, exactly as Caleb had predicted it would, and the head pressure over the new inlet was, to his evident private satisfaction, precisely what his calculations had promised. On a morning in the 3rd week of March, Dora opened the sluice gate for the first time. The water came down the clean-stoned race and struck the first bucket of the new wheel. The wheel turned. It turned slowly at first, the resistance of the millstone enormous, the whole building shivering with the transmission of force. Then it found its rhythm, and the sound that filled the stone-walled room was a deep, resonant turning, a grinding and rushing, together, that Caleb Mott, standing beside her with both hands on the stone housing, recognized from 23 years before, and felt go through him like a door opening. Dora put her palm on the millstone and felt it move under her hand. She did not cry. She stood very still for a long moment, her hand on the turning stone, and listened. Caleb was watching her. "Well," he said after a while. "Hook would have been pleased. Edmund would have been pleased," she said. "Who's Edmund, the man who sent me here?" Caleb Mott looked at her, then out at the turning wheel visible through the opening in the wall, then back at her. "Smart man," he said. The first customer came 2 days later. It was Mr. Theodore Baum, with 3 bushels of corn. He stood in the doorway of the mill, looking at the new wheel turning in the race, and at the clean flagstone floor, and at the millstone working, and at Dora standing beside it. And he had the expression of a man who has underestimated something and knows it, and is deciding how to hold that knowledge. By May there was a line, not a long line, not a busy line, but a steady one, the farmers from the Culver Creek watershed who had been paying the Route 9 rates and were happy for a closer option. Aldous Greer brought 6 wagon loads of winter wheat. He said nothing further about the stone walls or the land. He paid his milling fee and nodded and left, and that was enough. Mrs. Sprague came on a Saturday, not with grain but by herself, to see the place she had been hearing about for 4 months. She stood in the doorway of the mill as the wheel turned and the water sounded and the millstone ground, and she looked at everything with the thorough, unsparing attention of someone who knows what things cost. "Edmund Farrow," she said. "That was the man in Caldwell." "My teacher," Dora said. "He told me about this place in a letter, his last letter." Mrs. Sprague was quiet for a moment. "He knew you'd do this?" Dora thought about it. She looked at the folding rule on the bench, the one with EF scratched into the brass. "He knew I'd try," she said. "I think he figured that was enough." The town of Harwick did not hold a ceremony. It did not rename anything. There were no speeches. What happened was quieter than that, and more permanent. People began to refer to the Culver Creek mill the way you refer to a thing that has always been there and always worked. Matter-of-factly, as a feature of the landscape. The path down from the road got worn in a little deeper every week. Mr. Tabb stocked an extra grade of millstone grit at the hardware store. And the name Widow's Mill, which a few people had used in the early weeks in a way that was not entirely kind, was dropped without discussion and replaced by simply Finch's. On an evening in late May, Caleb Mott came to have coffee as he had begun to do on Thursdays. He lowered himself carefully onto his stool, his knees taking longer than they used to, and looked around the mill in the evening light. The fire in the small stove, the tools on the bench, the wheel at rest now, the sluice closed, the creek running outside in the cooling dark. "You know," he said, "when I built that first wheel in '84, Renner told me nobody would use it in 10 years. Said the new grain operations were going to take all the business." He blew on his coffee. He wasn't entirely wrong about the business, just wrong about everything else. Dora looked at him. "What else?" "About what a mill is for," Caleb said. He shrugged, a small old man shrug. "Turns out it's for more than grain." Dora set down her cup and looked at the place around her, the floor she had laid board by board, the walls she had repointed stone by stone, the wheels she had built timber by timber and fitting by fitting, with a dead man's tools and an old man's knowledge and her own two steady hands. She thought of Edmund Farrow's last letter. The sentence at the bottom, in his careful cramped hand. "Maybe you'll think so too." She thought she finally understood what he'd meant. Not that the mill had something left in it, that she did. "We'd like to thank you for spending this evening with us and with Dora Finch of Culver Creek. There's something in stories like this one. Not the triumph at the end, but the Tuesday mornings in between, when the only reason to keep going is the weight of the work already done and the quiet stubbornness of a person who hasn't yet been proven right. If this story found its way to something real in you, we'd love to hear about it in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from, and tell us if you've ever held on to something just because someone you trusted once believed it was worth holding. We'll see you next time.